Hello, this is Matthias Goertz with my monthly COVID-19 update. I'm going to share my screen. Here we are. Topic or title is New Mysticism. Start with a little quote. This is Goethe. Just read it for yourself. You can see that Goethe 250 years ago already dealt with the same issues that we are dealing with today. So maybe there is nothing new under the sun. Okay. Why am I entitling this edition New Mysticism? Well, I was struck over the last couple of weeks or so with some just events or things that I came across, which I just want to share, because they may be a pattern. So this is in the UK. The BBC reports a few days ago that 51% out of sort of young adults in the UK pray at least once a month, compared to 24% among those who are 55 years and older. So twice as many young people pray than do the elderly. And 50% of young people attend a place of worship at least once a month, and only 6% of the elderly do. That's fascinating. I mean, clearly there are some demographics at play, and the author of this article said so. He said, look, one of the major drivers could be that our demographics have changed, and we have, a more multicultural society, if you like. Bigger range of minority, they call minority faith, and some of those so-called minority faith may just have a higher proportion of practicing young people and a higher propensity to practice their religion than the sort of the traditional one, which is, I guess, in England mostly Anglicism, so Christianity, a version of Christianity. Whereas among the younger people, there may be many people who have other religions, right? And they may just have a higher propensity to practice that religion through prayer or through attending, a place of worship. So yeah, that I think that's a very good explanation, and that may be the main driver. There may be some other things, but still, even if it's a demographic effect, it is interesting, is it not? Because in Europe, at least, over the last 300 years, at least, with the Enlightenment, and this went into the age of Goethe, so it does link to Goethe. When Goethe was young, it was sort of the peak of Enlightenment, and then there came a sort of, if you like, a post-Enlightenment, where people started challenging some of the Enlightenment maxims and views. But it was sort of, when he was a young man, Goethe, it was the peak of Enlightenment. And one of the most important things that Enlightenment in Europe tried to do was to push back the influence of the churches. At that time, that would be predominantly Christian churches, yes, but any churches, really. They push back the influence of religion on people's minds and free their minds for rational thinking. That was a major cornerstone of the Enlightenment movement. So what we're seeing here, whatever the demographics and so on, but what we're seeing here is a reversal of that. So here we are 300 years after the Enlightenment. We are going back to where people were, in the Middle Ages in terms of their behavior towards religion, at least on the surface, right? At least, these are very crude numbers and crude, criteria. How often do you pray, and how often do you go to church? It doesn't clearly tell us everything we would like to know about the mental makeup of these younger people here that we're talking about, but it is indicative, right? It is indicative, no more than that, but it is indicative. And I thought I share this because religions are a version of mysticism, right? Whether they like it or not, right? They would refute that sternly, but that's what they are actually. And mystifications, right? And so if more people practice a religion, whatever religion it is, it doesn't matter. It does challenge the notion that we have become more rational in what we do compared to maybe people in the Middle Ages. And I'm talking about the European cultural context here, because even the word Middle Ages is a European-centric concept, right? It doesn't not necessarily apply to like China or India or other cultural regions, right? So I'm not trying to overcomplicate things. So I'm thinking here from a European perspective, but some of that may apply elsewhere, and some of that may not. But so there is a possibility here that our young people are putting less store on rational thinking, on rational argument, on factual data, etc., then maybe the generation that came before them, which or two generations before them, who are now 55 and older. Again, this is just one indicator, and I don't want to over stress this point. It just came across my screen, so to speak. But I think it does tell us something. At least it invites us to investigate further. Is humanity, or is at least in Europe, so, are the young people moving away from rationality and, if you like, back in time towards the good old mysticisms of the past? That is, I think, an interesting question. Now, climate change, that's emerging as my pet project, I guess. If I get tired of talking about COVID, maybe I will talk more about climate change. So there was a survey here. This is also from the BBC. And mind you, the reason I often have BBC articles is simply that I occasionally watch BBC on TV. And if on TV, they sometimes refer to a study, or sometimes it's this sort of running band at the bottom, if you know what I mean, where, so short messages run across of, scientists have found this, or a study shows this, right? And that's usually where I pick up and say, oh, that sounds interesting. And then I go online to the BBC and, or Google and try to find that study or that article, right? That's how I get to. That's why a lot of what I share is BBC, but I try to share other sources as well. I'm not trying to be dependent on the BBC, but that's just my pattern at home tends to be to watch the BBC, because then the whole family can watch it in English. If I watch Deutsche Welle, then my wife, for example, wouldn't get half of it. So there's a reason I do an English one, and I think the BBC is better than most. I mean, as far as media go, they're all terrible, but this is slightly less terrible than most. So yes, so that's why I get to BBC things, and that's why maybe sometimes you see a lot of things here that are from the UK or from the US, because that just happens to be the regions that the BBC covers extensively, right? It doesn't mean it's representative or anything like that. No, it isn't, but it is indicative, right? So here's a study that says young people are very worried is the headline. Nearly 60% of young people approached said they felt very worried or extremely worried. more than 45% of those questions said feelings about the climate affect their daily lives. So young people are very worried, and especially, maybe not only about one thing, but especially also about the climate. 2/3 reported feeling sad, afraid, and anxious. Many felt fear, anger, despair, grief, and shame, as well as hope. Apparently in conjunction, especially with the climate. Over half of them said humanity is doomed. Well, I also say that, so I sympathize with that, but I say it for different reasons. I think I'm saying it, we are doomed precisely because of these types of young people who are worried about something. That's why we are doomed. Not because of the climate, but because of human beings thinking the way they think, or not thinking the way they think. That's why I think we are doomed. But okay, they think we are doomed because of the climate. So I mean, this is extraordinary. I don't think that's ever happened in the history of mankind, that people were worried about the climate, right? I mean, to some degree, people have always been dependent on weather, and they have prayed to the gods to bring them rain and so on. So yes, but climate is a very, very big, complex thing that very few people understand. In fact, maybe nobody does really, but there's probably some people who study climate and have a real in-depth understanding of what climate involves. It's a big complex. So I guarantee you that these young people, that none of them understand what climate even is, right? At least not in any kind of significant way. None of them will have studied this, and if they are young people, then obviously they will not have had a chance to study it, right? Maybe some of them will go on to university and study climate. That would be great. I welcome and invite that, but those interviewed here, not a single one of them knows even what climate is, right? Because it is very complex. So they're worried. I mean, the bottom line of this is young people are worried about something that is like a specter to them, or like a ghost, an apparition, which they cannot explain. So it scares them because, they don't know what it is, but it seems to be big and threatening. Right? That is the hallmark of mysticism, right? They're defining, or not defining, but just putting up this haunting, this specter that haunts them, that they don't understand, and they say they're afraid of it, and they feel anger about it, and despair and grief and shame, all of that, about a thing that they very obviously don't understand. Right? They could not possibly have, at 16-year-old said something. Not all of them are 16, I guess, but these are young people, so whatever that exactly means, there's no chance that any one of them has ever spent a significant amount of time to think about the climate. There's like zero chance. I would argue anyways that there's virtually no person on this planet who actually has, but there may be a few people, yeah, but they're very, very few and far in between, right? So, but none of these young people will ever have thought in a systematic way about what climate even is. So they're worried. So they're worried about something that they have no inkling of what it is. So they're worried about something that I wouldn't say it doesn't exist. There is such a thing as climate, right? But it has no tangible sort of reality to them at the moment. It's just it's a specter. Yeah. Now the survey says we are not just measuring how they feel, but what they think. Well, I don't think so. There's zero thinking involved here in these young people. I'm sorry to say, but this is all about what they feel. Yeah, and that's fine. I mean, we are interested to know what people feel. Yeah, but this is not about anything related to thinking. There's zero thinking in this. Right? None of them have thought. And when I say thinking, as you know, I mean that like a philosopher thinks about thinking: systematic, critical, skeptical, logical, rational thinking. That's what I mean by thinking, right? Sustained thinking. Not like, oh, I think I'm hungry. That's not thinking, okay? So none of them have actually done any thinking. And so they are not in any position to share what they think about climate, because they know nothing about it. But they do have a feeling, and that I fully agree. They seem to have a very strong feeling about something that haunts them like a specter, and that they even say, here, 4 out of 10 said they're hesitant to have children. Now, that may be a good thing, by the way. I happen to think that this planet is hugely overpopulated with humans, which is part of maybe that complex of this problem that they're sort of alluding to, maybe. But that is an opinion. I can only say I have that opinion. I have not thought about that very deeply. But it is sort of a hunch, if you like, that it's the main issue is overpopulation, massive overpopulation. But okay, we can come back to that later. But so if people say they even are thinking about not having children, that may actually be a good thing. But it is not rational. It's not rational to even not want to have children, which is a very, very human thing to do, to have children. And most humans aspire to that. It's irrational to not even want to have children because of this specter that they don't understand. And severe weather events worsen, mental health impacts will follow. So, okay, here they're talking about weather. So there's one thing about this whole debate about climate is people don't seem to think that there's a difference between temperature rise, which is a statistical fact. Over the last 50 or even 100 years, where we have data, where we're tracking data in a systematic way, it can be shown that over time, temperature has been rising. That's a trend. That's a fact. Temperatures have been rising, right? And it's very likely that that's connected to our output of CO2 and so on. That's very likely. Yeah. Now, from temperature to weather is one big step. Yes, it's related. Temperature is one of the key elements of weather, right? And it influences weather patterns and so on. I have no doubt about that. And there are meteorologists and other people who, are thinking about those connections, right? Yes, temperature in some way or another will influence weather. That is true, right? But in what way, in what manner, that is largely, as far as I can see, speculative today, right? Now, from weather to climate is yet another big step, right? So the first observation I have here, whether it's in the media or among those young people or whoever, they seem to be happily mixing up temperature rise with changes in weather patterns, as they call it here, or weather events, and with climate. And they think it's all sort of the same. At least they speak as if they think it is the same, but it is absolutely not the same. So here we are again at the same, we are now maybe at the same level as what I sort of started saying 80 months ago about the discussion around COVID when it started to come up. And I have been insisting on all this time. As a virus is not the same as a pneumonia, right? Even though the media still today insist on saying, in Singapore, for example, 2,400 people have tested positive for COVID, right? No, you can't test positive for COVID. There's no test for COVID. They have tested positive for SARS-CoV-2, which is a virus, right? And having the virus is not the same thing as having pneumonia. Only 1% of those with the virus get pneumonia, right? 1% out of 100%. That's not the same. That's very different. And if the politicians had just understood early on that little difference between, having a virus and having pneumonia, and that one is 100% of us will have that virus and repeatedly, and the other one is 1% of us to get the pneumonia out of the 100, right? If they had just understood that little detail, we would not be in the mess we are in, right? So defining even the situation and the things that you're observing, just defining them and being clear in your mind that they are not the same things is absolutely vital if you want. sorry, if you want to solve any problem, you've got to define the problem. Right? Nobody, I guarantee you, nobody has defined climate change, right? Which is now apparently that the world is sort of, agreeing to call this phenomenon that they think they're thinking about, right? But if you asked 10 people what is climate change, you would get 11 different answers, right? There is no definition of what that is supposed to be, right? And people haven't even started to really lay that out, right? And that's my worry again. It's déjà vu, right? It's exactly the same we had 18 months ago with COVID. People don't define the problem, and then they get to all kinds of wrong solutions. Wrong, either ineffective, wrong in the sense of illegal, and even wrong in the sense that they're even counterproductive and make things worse, right? And exactly the same is bound to happen here if we do not start to talk about this in a kind of a rational and a structured manner. Then this is much more complicated than a common cold virus like SARS-CoV-2. This is much more complicated because temperatures do interact with weather in various ways, and weather is an important part of climate. And yes, there is a bigger picture here. I agree with that. I'm not saying there is no such thing as climate change. I'm just saying nobody knows what it is. Nobody has even started to systematically think about it. I'm not aware that anybody has. Yes, there are books being published, but I mean, I haven't read all these books, mind you, right? But from anything I read or hear, it's oh my gosh, it's the quality of the discussion is so poor, and it's so hysterical and so over politicized, and there's no sober discussion. And insofar as there is, someone may say, oh, well, you're wrong, Matthias, there are some people who have a sober discussion, then it happens somewhere behind closed doors in some kind of academic institution from which it never emerges, right? It's like the same thing again with like COVID. Remember, my IFR assumption of 0.2% is based on, primarily based on a meta study that was published in, I think, June last year, of more than 30 different local or country level antibody surveys. And they came to, I think, 0.24%, right? And I've then trended it down a bit, so that's why I got to 0.2%. But it's in that neighborhood. They gave me that assurance that I'm in the right ballpark, right? That was a very systematic meta study of more than 30 different studies, most of them, and I haven't tested that, but most of them probably well done. And the team who did the meta study, they did check every one of those studies and do we trust the study, doesn't meet our standards, etc. So there were some that they even didn't include because they weren't comfortable about the methodology or what, right? So there was a due process done, and there is a figure out that's 0.24. Not a single, and that's the most vital figure in understanding any infection is the IFR, right? How fatal is the thing, right? Nobody cared. Nobody, not a single government, as far as I can see, has talked about this number, ever, right? Even though it's there, right? Science does sometimes provide interesting insights, but nobody uses them, right? And so I'm just totally worried that, yes, there may be someone somewhere in a corner doing some great work on temperature or on weather or whatnot, or even on climate, but nobody knows and nobody cares. Yeah, people just step in front of the camera and make a big song and dance, but they don't care to figure out what is actually the case and what is actually happening and what does it actually mean, right? I mean, it's one thing to say, yeah, temperatures are rising. Yeah, that's a fact. That's just stating a fact. That's okay. But what does it mean, right? There's no intelligent conversation about what it means. Zero, as far as I can see, zero, right? People have failed to care for the planet. 83 agreed. Yeah, well, whatever that means, right? First of all, we need to understand that nature takes care of itself. We are part of that. Yeah, maybe if we could start with taking care of ourselves as humans, for example, learn to think, and then act rationally, at least to some degree. I understand people have emotions and we're not always rational beings, neither am I, right? But if we at least behaved somewhat more rationally, maybe a lot of this would just go away. Maybe there's no problem other than ourselves, right? So yeah, but people don't do that, right? They just, oh, we're destroying the planet. No, we're not destroying the planet. The planet would laugh. If the planet could hear us, it would laugh. Homeric laughter, remember? It could not stop laughing. The thought that we are destroying the planet, the planet would be laughing about it. And anyways, if we did destroy, let's say we exploded, we had so much TNT and so many nuclear weapons that we could actually explode this planet, then all the other planets around, they would just be laughing. Yeah. What does it mean we destroy the planet or we fail to care for the planet? What does it mean? Yeah. We are not here to care for the planet. This is like human beings playing God and yet at the same time being the most primitive in terms of using their own brain, right? There's a disconnect here. Maybe before you start worrying about whether you can play God, maybe you just start playing human being and, for example, use your brain, right? You have it, you may as well start using it, right? But this is playing God, right? Oh, we have to now protect this planet. No, God didn't give the planet to us into our protection. No, there's no God, by the way, in case you haven't noticed, right? And no, he wouldn't give some human figures that evolution happens to have thrown up. He wouldn't give this planet into, their care. No. This is self-appointed care. It's like, as I say, some people now want to play God and they self-appoint themselves as caretakers of this planet. But I tell you, you are not alone on this planet. There are 8 billion of us humans, and there are quadrillions and quadrillions and quadrillions of other life forms on this planet. And you're just saying, oh, and I'm, Greta Thunberg, or, I'm going to come back to her, or one of those types. And I'm God now. And, I'm now entrusted to take care of this planet, You're right. This is what we're getting. This is what we're getting. I don't want to die. I don't want to live in a world that doesn't care for children and animals. Yeah, but I don't want to live in a world where humans just talk bullshit. To be honest, that's maybe my trigger point, my tiger territory. I don't like to hear this bullshit. It's terrible to me. It gives me a headache. Okay. New fears, that's typically, especially fears that are intangible and hard to define or impossible to define, that are more like a specter than like something tangible. That is in my view, is a sign of a new mysticism. So that's why this page is related to the previous page. Another related one, German federal elections about a week ago. I just want to point your attention to the green bar. On the left, there's a green bar, which gives you the absolute percentage of votes that each party obtained in the federal election in Germany. And you can see the Green Party, which is the green bar, is now the third strongest force after the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, which are the two sort of traditional mainstay. One is a bit center left and the other one is a bit center right, but they're sort of the centric parties, sort of the middle of the road kind of parties. The Greens are now the biggest challengers of that old order. On the right, you see the relative changes in percentage points relative to the previous federal election 4 years ago. And you see that in absolute percentage terms, these are absolute numbers, not just relative. The Greens have been the big winners. Yeah. They have an absolute increase in the percentage points of 6.4 percentage points. So in other words, if they have 14.8 here on the list in total, minus the 6.4 means they had 8.4 at the last election. They went from 8.4 to 14.8. That's almost doubling their share of the vote within 4 years, right? I don't want to go into too much details how this happens, and so just one interesting indicator is that the Greens among the new voters, the first-time voters, so the ones who turned 18 during the last 4 years and are now able to vote or allowed to, permitted to vote, among those first-time voters, the Greens are the strongest party. They have about, I think if I remember correctly, about 30% of the first-time voters. So those young people that we just previously talked about in that survey in the UK, these people in Germany, they're voting Green. And number one topic, I can tell you, climate change. It used to be different. It used to be nuclear power. It used to be animal protection. It used to be, protecting primeval forests, especially rainforests, and so on. The topics of the Green Party have evolved, but now it's climate change. That's the big one. So it's just another indication how these young people, they are basically acquiring a new religion. Yeah. So the ones who pray, go to a place of worship and pray, they are conventional believers, if you like. They believe in the old religions, whether it's Christianity or Islam or others. But these people here, there may be some overlap between them, but it's probably quite a separate group. These people here, they have a new faith, which is we must save the planet, or we must stop climate change. We must wage war on climate change. It's very similar now, the language even is similar to what you heard 18 months ago with SARS-CoV-2, coronavirus. We must go to war against the coronavirus. So now the new religion, and that never caught up with many people, right? That war on a virus, that is not very sexy, right? But the war on climate change, that is really catching up with the young generation, especially. So it's a new religion. So again, it's a new mysticism, because none of them, as I say, know what they're talking about. Right? They just feel very strongly, oh, this is dangerous, we must do something, we'll all be dead, or we'll all be, the planet will be destroyed, or whatever it is, right? We must act now. And they do it with a ferocity, especially in the way they push the politicians to make decisions, right? Decisions about something that nobody understands, mind you. But immediately, we must act immediately. It's just like Merkel 18 months ago, close borders, export control, lockdowns, right? Completely unthinking. Just do something. We must do something. We must do. So these young people are in the same mode, right? They're totally convinced that we must act now, otherwise we are doomed. They just have no idea what actually they're trying to achieve, right? Or what it means. But they just want to act. They do not want to think first. Let's put it this way. And that's, to me, that's what I call a mysticism, right? Not thinking, but just believing or feeling. Yeah. So this is how it hangs together. Here we have the young lady, Greta Thunberg, I think, right? Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, that's very funny. I like that. I also like to say blah, blah, blah. And I would like to officially now here in front of my camera and my many million of followers, I want to say to Greta Thunberg, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I've not seen any other 16 or 17-year-old blah, blah, blah quite as much as her. I mean, it can't, I mean, it's like a sheep, right? She said, the science did not lie. Yeah, my young lady, what the hell do you know about science? And I'm not, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying young people cannot be smart and cannot know certain things. I'm not saying young people shouldn't have a voice. And I have young young adults as children, and I love them dearly and want the best for them. And I do want them to be politically engaged, and I shouldn't say I want them to because it's up to them. But I don't mind them being politically engaged if they so choose, right? And of course, I don't mind Greta Thunberg being engaged. But there is absolutely zero thinking behind what she says. Right? That is my concern. It is pure mysticism. Right? Carbon emissions are on track to rise by 60%. Yeah, that may be the case. So what? Yeah. Heating up. Okay. International agreed limit of 1.5 Celsius. Okay. Yeah, I know. Sometimes politicians have to come together and make some kind of a heuristic, set some target, because otherwise you can't track and you can't, know who has invested how much and who is doing what in order to meet your target. I understand it's like in business that sometimes it's useful to set a target. It concentrates minds, and I understand that, but I also understand the limits of these targets. They are inevitably arbitrary. They have no meaning in themselves other than banging heads together. Right? So they're a crutch. This 1.5 Celsius target that has been agreed is just a crutch. Now, once you've agreed a target, I can understand that some people say, now you have to, you have committed to it, you've agreed to it, so please now try to meet it, right? I can understand that, right? But this is not a holy grail, this 1.5. In itself, it means nothing, right? And if some countries say, but we have other priorities, or some people say, well, can we think about this a moment before we go overboard? Yes, I think so. I think we need to think a little bit before we go overboard, right? And so Greta and her ilk have decided to completely block any kind of thought, right? And leave thinking aside completely, and just go in with blah blah blah. Right? That's why I thought her speech was so fitting, because she was basically blah blah blahing about herself. It's very self-referential. She is the biggest blah 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 person out there, even worse than some of the other politicians, right? And they are bad enough. Right? She mentions Boris Johnson. Yeah, she's right, right? I mean, yeah, these politicians all blah blah blahing. That's correct, Greta. That's correct. Just you are blah blah blahing even worse than them. So yeah. Anyway, so we have new prophets, right? And our latest prophet is a 16 or 17-year-old girl who now is being worshipped. The other day I saw that she's being considered for the Nobel Peace Prize or so. I mean, she's going to war, mind you. I'm always surprised about the people who win peace prizes. I mean, they seem never to be people who actually try to make peace. Never. They call it Nobel Peace Prize, but it's a Nobel War Prize, actually. So she's on the war path here, and she will get maybe the Peace Prize for it. It's wonderful. It's wonderful, and it's not that I don't, want her to win a prize. I mean, who am I, right? I mean, please win your prize. But I just love it, and things are so extremely inappropriate, right? I mean, she's sort of about the last person who is peaceful, right? Or who wants to make peace. She's on the war path, and yeah, good for her. So, well, we've had American presidents getting the Peace Prize. There are billions, literally billions of people out there who are really peaceful and who are really living every day a peaceful life. Why don't you just give that prize to one of those billions of people who actually make peace? Anyways, I don't really care about this prize, so I just thought it was very funny. Anyways, there's one more thing I wanted to share before I get to my main topic. And this is, I don't know how this really fits in, but I just thought it was brilliant. There's in Singapore, which, one of the most robotized societies in the world, and possibly the most robotized society in the world. And by robotized, I mean that people are basically more and more turned into robots, right? They're linked into a digital system where the people are just like an avatar, really, right? Something that moves around in an increasingly digital landscape that surrounds them and into which they are fully embedded and out of which they cannot escape, right? So Singapore is testing a little robot to drive around public spaces and spot any undesirable behavior and then trigger real-time alerts to the command and control center and display a message on its dashboard to educate the public and deter such behaviors. So Singapore is now, I mean, having degraded everybody to cattle, if not to robots, Singapore is now going to the stage where a robot will tell a human being how to behave. And you may say, yeah, I mean, you know, so this little thing moves around, it's got a couple of cameras, it takes pictures, and it is programmed to note certain things, such as maybe someone being very agitated or someone smoking. You know, in Singapore, you're not allowed to smoke unless it's very few, very clearly delimited, dedicated places where you're allowed to smoke. So, you know, in most countries, you're generally allowed to smoke, except maybe in a certain type of place, like a restaurant or so. In Singapore, it's the opposite, right? You're nowhere are you allowed to smoke, except in some dedicated places. And, you know, so the robot can probably, I imagine, with a camera and so on, can identify if someone has like I don't know, a cigarette in their mouth, or makes a behavior like this, or, you know, motion discovery or something. And so it recognizes someone seems to be smoking, and it knows exactly, of course, it's pre-programmed where the smoking, dedicated smoking areas are. So if it catches someone who is smoking outside that dedicated area, it will apparently drive up to that person and warn them, and also trigger real-time alert to the police, basically to the police, right? Or this is whatever equivalent of the police, right? Who are controlling this. But it will also, most interestingly, it will actually communicate to that person, you are misbehaving, and I'm warning you, if you don't behave, you know, you will be in trouble, right? So, I mean, normally the government in Singapore treats people like children, you know, I tell you what to do, you don't know yet, but I tell you. Now they go the next step. It's a robot telling people how they have to behave. So that, I mean, that's quite extraordinary. And what does it have to do with my topic of new mysticism? Yeah, marginally it does, I think, because there is another element I fear to this mysticism, which is technology, which is this idea that technology will solve all sort of evils in society. First of all, of course, you have to define what you mean by an evil, right? And that is, of course, very contentious, right? In Singapore, it's evil to smoke a cigarette, you know, yeah. In the past, they would have come to you and said, you go to hell. Today, where people don't really believe in hell as much as they used to do, they send a robot and say, you go to jail if you don't stop, right? But it is part of this new mysticism, is this whole idea that science and technology are somehow a greater order of being, greater than ourselves, and it will eventually control us, right? And manage us and run us. So we will be run by, I mean, according to the Singaporean government, we will be run by robots, right? It's not humans running robots, it's robots running humans. Now you may say, yeah, but there's a human behind somewhere, a programmer and also a control person, right? So if the control person sees something on the camera, he can even send then maybe commands to the robot or something. So the robot is not an autonomous robot. No, but it's the first step towards an autonomous robot, right? I mean, there's a difference, I think, between having a fixed installed CATV camera, which of course in Singapore you have everywhere, right? All the public spaces are, of course, controlled, right? With a human sitting somewhere in a control center. So you might say the movable robot is no different, but I would argue it is different. You know, there's the first step towards autonomy on the part of the robot is that it becomes mobile. And it decides, based on whatever program it has, whatever AI, so-called, it decides where it goes, right? Second, it starts communicating proactively with a person, giving them commands. Yeah. Display a message to educate. So you have a robot educate a human being. I mean, that is so fantastic, and it is so typical for Singapore, right? Because a human being in Singapore is, I think for a lot of Singaporean in the government and the technocrats, they consider a human being to be below a robot. So they have no difficulty imagining a robot educating a human being. They don't think that that is perverse or completely nonsensical. Yeah, they don't. On the contrary, they already imagine a future where the robot is so much smarter than any human, other than themselves. Of course, there's a small elite who, of course, wants to stay in control of the robots. They don't want the Matrix kind of, the movie kind of scenario where everybody gets captured by the machines and the machines rule. They want a small elite rules the machines, and then the machines rule all the the broad masses. Right? That's, I think, what's behind this. Right? I mean, they may not say it that way, but that is. So technology becomes a mechanism for a small group of people to control everybody else. So that is similar to, for example, a Catholic hierarchy where you have a pope and then bishops, and the bishops use certain technologies, certain methods or ways of communicating to control the masses. So this is a bit like Catholic Church, a hierarchy. But one level of the hierarchy is not humans. The humans are replaced by machines. The machines become the connective tissue between a small elite on the top and everybody else at the bottom. I think that is, from a point of view of both faith in technology and also of using technology as a tool to create a hierarchy, this is somewhat like a religion. Yeah. And it's not new that religions use tools and technologies to broadcast themselves. I mean, the printing press did probably more to Christianity in Europe than anything else, right? Because all of a sudden you could get everybody a Bible, right? Which was not possible before. Bible was very expensive before the printing with movable types was invented by Gutenberg, right, in the 15th century. Before that, most people could not afford a Bible. So technology has always been used by religions, right? But I think this is a new mysticism. This poor chap here, this young man here, standing there, and a machine comes to him and educates him. That is fantastic. So this is where we're heading, dear people. Yeah. Welcome to the new normal. So usual program, monthly prizes. So the 3 Silly Monkeys prize, I am not handing out this month. There is no winner. That's not because of any kind of shortage of candidates. The opposite is true. There are now so many candidates because every single country is now having discriminatory measures based on whether you're vaccinated, or they have these kind of terror programs where you have to show that you had a PCR test done, or whatever these things. Basically a terror regime that is now all-encompassing. Yeah, virtually everywhere. I'm sure some countries may not have it, but most countries do in some way or another. So this terror regime, this COVID terror regime, has now been encompassed the world. Right? So it's no longer useful for me to pick one or the other and say, oh, here's one, and here's one, and here's one. There are so many, and it's become the new normal. Yeah, discrimination on the basis of whether you were vaccinated or whether you were tested is now de facto the baseline. Yeah. So any constitution in the world that said anything about you are not allowed to discriminate is dead. Yeah. All those constitutions, there's probably most countries, somewhere in the constitution probably it says you're not supposed to discriminate, is dead. Because it's now official across the world, everywhere, that not only can you discriminate, but the governments even, they say we must discriminate. New faith, new mysticism, right? Some higher order told us we must now, discrimination now is not only sexy, it's mandatory. So there's no point picking on winners here, because they're all the same now. Yes, there's some variations. I'll get to that in a moment, but you know, by and large, it's happening everywhere. So it's no longer fruitful for me to pick some examples, right? Obviously, I've been talking about this for many months. It was clear it was coming. I'm not surprised, but yeah, it's arrived, right? So no silly monkey prize, because there would have been thousands of candidates. So nobody gets the prize. Now, Lady Liberty Prize, slightly different. Unfortunately, there are never very many candidates. At least not that come to my attention, right? So I have 2 candidates this month for the Lady Liberty Prize. One candidate, the French people, not all of them, mind you, but you know, some number, 140,000. So this is early September, but at that point, for 8 consecutive Saturdays, a big crowd has been gathering in Paris. On that particular Saturday, it was about 140,000 people. Big crowds have been gathering in Paris to protest against the vaccine pass, or the health pass, as it's called. It's got data on vaccination as well as on any kind of test, and whether you've recovered from COVID, you know, which is one of those funny things, because almost nobody gets COVID, so very few people can have recovered from it. I think they mean whether you had tested positive on the virus. I think that's what they mean, right? But they don't know what they mean. So yeah. Anyway, so these people here, and this, I love this woman here who is dressed up like that. There's a famous painting by Delacroix about the French Revolution, where the woman, bare-breasted with the French flag, you know, moves the head, and then people with guns and so on around her. Very famous painting. Unfortunately, she's not bare-breasted, but she gets pretty close. Yeah, she made an effort. So anyway, she's obviously alluding to that famous painting, and she's leading a crowd here of protesters. And you know, I've been very critical of France, because it is one of those countries that pretend to be the cradle of freedom. And clearly at the moment, they're not. They are not even average. Within Europe, they are probably below average in terms of the freedom they grant their people. So it's terrible, terrible, terrible. And they've just announced that the state of exception will last until next summer at least. Yeah, so they're in a permanent state of exception, and it's mind-boggling. I've studied the French Revolution quite in some detail, because I was quite interested in it. And it's just mind-boggling how they just throw it all out of the window like that. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people fought for these rights. Many died. Many people died to fight for liberty and equality, égalité. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. All 3, I said this in some other talk, all 3 are dead in France, completely, utterly destroyed. Right? And there are some people who can see that. Now, it's interesting here, study by Le Figaro, 67% of French people approve of the health pass. There you go. Macron will say it's a democracy, the majority is behind me, we're doing the right thing. No, that's not what a democracy does. Yeah, democracy should do the right thing, and you're doing the wrong thing. You're destroying the very basis of your democracy that you're claiming. You have to defend the democracy, even against majorities, if they want to destroy it. That's your role as a French president. And Mr. Macron, I think, has not understood his role at all. Not at all. He doesn't have any sense of what a French president ought to do. He's the most important, the most senior protector of the Constitution. That's literally his only job. Everything else, you know, will fall into place. He can have his people around him do. The only thing a French president has to do is protect the French Constitution. And he's doing the opposite. He's completely destroying it. So yeah, but these people recognize that, I think. And so they are, you know, they are an appropriate finalist for this Lady Liberty Prize. And I have a second finalist, and here we are back to the English. A gentleman by the name Sajid Javid said we ditch any plans to have a vaccine passport in England. I previously gave prizes to some governors of several US federal states who passed laws against any discrimination. So that's even stronger. This guy is just saying we're currently not doing it, right? It doesn't mean he cannot turn around tomorrow and change his mind, right? In those US states that I gave a prize, they had actually passed a law that disallows you from discriminating. That is a very strong statement. This is a relatively weaker statement, but in the context of Europe, where almost every country now is going crazy about these vaccine passports, it is a positive sign. And I have to say, for all the mistakes that have been done made in Britain, and also for all the wobbling of this Johnson guy, who is like a clown, right? He goes one way. For all that, among the Europeans, if we exclude the Swedish, I find that the British, or at least the English, because the Scottish, for example, may think differently about this, right? And this may be one of those things that are devolved to the different nations, as they call it in England, right? In Britain. So this is all, I think he's speaking only really about England, but at least in England, I have had the impression that there is still in the general public some sense of individual rights and freedoms, more than anywhere else in Europe, with the possible exception of Sweden. And that, I think, again, it deserves being called out. It deserves being called out. The English don't have this tendency that most of Europe has to, oh, we'll just simply regulate, and we'll just simply put another rule in place and another constraint. You know, the English are a bit like the Americans, at least some of the Americans, at least in some of the states in America. They are hesitant to impose ever more rules and regulations and discriminations and all that stuff on people. And I appreciate that. So I wanted to call that out. As a European, I care for this a lot, and I'm very disappointed with Germany. As a German, I'm very disappointed with Germany. And I'm glad to occasionally see some 140,000 people in France protesting against this, and some politician in England saying we are not currently going there. Right? I appreciate that. Right? Now the winner, you might have guessed, is the sexy lady here with her team. The French people, some of them anyhow. At least some of them are going onto the street and fighting for freedom. Only unsuccessfully so far, but there are some people on this planet who do understand the concept of liberty, even if they're a small minority, and that is worth celebrating. Okay, we have a Homeric Laughter Prize, remember, for politicians or others who make the most hilarious announcements. There is no prize winner this time. There are so many hilarious announcements that they are no longer hilarious. Right? They have become the new normal. Yeah. I mean, politicians are always hilarious, so that's not really new. But I mean, on this topic, it's no longer it's pointless for me to keep pointing out that what they're saying is wrong or misleading or counterproductive. It's just because everything they say is in that category, right? So it's like all tens of thousands of politicians that we have on this planet, they all should be wearing this dunce head, right? And stand in the corner and be ashamed. But none of them is, right? None of them is ashamed of what they do. They have no shame, actually. They don't know what it is to be ashamed. So there's no point laughing about them. It's like, it's very boring. So no laughter today. Let's move on. Yes, we are still in the fractured world, no change. Let's look at our numbers. So penetration with the coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, is now at approximately 73%. It's been a fairly quiet month. You know, things are just sort of moving quietly ahead. I talked about last time that, of course, we are now at the sort of beginning of the autumn and winter season, meaning the common cold season in the Northern Hemisphere. And we're starting to see that in, for example, Eastern Europe. So if you look at data in Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Romania, some of the Balkans, some of the Baltic states, maybe starting to see it in Poland. So you can see how you can literally look at those SARS-CoV-2 case numbers and look at in which countries in Europe are they rising and in which countries are they not yet rising. And you can literally map how the common cold seems to be coming from Siberia or somewhere from the east anyways, and, you know, moving into Europe. So now it's sort of reached Poland, I think, and that means probably be a week from now or 2 weeks from now, it will have reached Germany and maybe France, and then it will get into, you know, across the Alps into northern Italy and into the Balkans further down, and then eventually, maybe a week later, you know, it will be in, you know, southern Spain, right? So you can see this interesting, you know, progression, and you can actually quite see that in the case numbers. So that's quite interesting. If you ever wanted to know how does the seasonal common cold, you know, come into Europe, it comes like, if you've seen those graphics of the plague, the so-called Black Death in the 14th century, it came via Constantinople and via the east and then spread into Europe. It's a bit like that. So the common cold also seems to be coming from the east, and it's probably just because the temperatures in Eastern Europe are always a few degrees lower than in the rest of Europe, because the western part of Europe is exposed to the Gulf Stream, which warms it, right? And it's a warmer and wetter climate. And the eastern part of Europe tends to be more continental climate that comes often from the east, literally from Siberia or from the northeast. And so it seems that climate pattern is bringing in the cold first. But of course, it's just a matter of a week or two, and then the rest of Europe will also have it. And, you know, I haven't looked at like Canada or places like Korea, for example. You will probably start seeing this as well, because they have the type of climate like Eastern Europe, where, you know, if it's happening in Eastern Europe, you would expect it to happen in those places. And then maybe Japan, which is a bit wetter, more an ocean climate, whereas I think in Korea you could get sort of cold weather from like Manchuria and so on. So it's a bit different. So in Japan, it's probably another couple of weeks away, as you see. So if you wanted to, you could start mapping this, right? Maybe someone is doing that. I'm not going to do that, but it's interesting. And you can see in the COVID, in the SARS-CoV-2 case numbers, not yet in the fatalities maybe, but in the case numbers, you can see this movement. So 73%. As I said before, this is sort of flattening. One, because as it approaches 100% penetration, it would be naturally flattening. You know, it's called herd immunity, right? It just slows down because it's by definition 100%. The way I have to find this is not repeat infections. This is first-time infections. So by definition, the maximum is 100%, right? And as it approaches that maximum, it will inevitably slow down, and, you know, the curve will flatten, right? And then we have impact of vaccinations, which do slow down the spread of the virus. And since they protect a lot of people from getting seriously ill and dying, this figure will never reach 100% now, right? Thanks to the vaccines. So we will always remain below 100%. And, you know, the bigger that gap, the more we've used the vaccines effectively to save people. And the corresponding fertility numbers is we're now at 9.35 million COVID fatalities calculated, which is a factor of 1.95 times the reported fatalities. Right? Remember, we've been hovering at about 2x for some time. It's slowly trending down. That's just an effect of how I'm modeling. I've explained it before. I don't want to explain it again, but yeah, there's a certain trending down of that multiplier, but slowly. Yeah. And I've projected out for the 1st of January, so 3 months out, that will be at about 11. The curve may look steep here, but that's just because I've cut the x-axis. So, it's actually, there's a big jump here, right? So it's actually flattening, not increasing. Just visually, it looks like it's steeper, but that's just a visual effect of my display. But basically, we're going to about 11 million by 1st of January. And we know from last year that by early January, the worst of the winter season in the Northern Hemisphere is already kind of over. Or that, let's say that's around early January is the peak. Yeah. Fatalities, okay, may peak a little later, right, because of that delay. So maybe they peak in late January. But basically, in terms of the infections, it's already past the peak here. Yeah. So yes, there will be, if my projection is correct, there will be still more fatalities. It will go above the 11 million. But as I said, it would not, if my IFR is correct, if I haven't got a need to adjust it, which may still happen, right? But so far I haven't. I've adjusted it once upwards, but the last 3 months it's been stable, and there's nothing at the horizon at the moment that would suggest that I may have to upward revise my IFR. But if I had to, then that number 12.85 million, the calculated number of total COVID fatalities, would also move up, right? But if it remains where it is, 12.85, and by 1st of January we are at 11, we're still going to go a bit higher towards that number, but we will not reach that number. So there will be a net gain of lives, and that's predominantly thanks to the vaccines. Yeah. Now, the calculated excess mortality keeps going up. It's also slowing down, perhaps, but it is sort of going up in tandem with the COVID fatalities. So there is still there's still a lot of fatalities now that are due to government policies and what they did to people's lives, right? And these may carry on for a while. These don't easily go away, right? Because some of the effects of what the governments have done have lasting, economic things, for example, have lasting effects on populations. Now, the point in the red box is, in the moment where that blue line cuts through that horizontal 12.85 million, it means that more people have already died now than would have if we had just done nothing. If we had done nothing, then we would be at 12.85 million, if my model is correct. And we are now already above that. So government is killing more people than it's saving, even though we have that wonderful vaccine. Okay, last time I spoke about that the idea that because it takes children something like 6, 7, 8 years to get through the period in which they adjust to the common cold cocktail. So at some point, they no longer have more common colds than do adults, right? But it takes at least those 6 to 7 years. It may even take longer, but it's a rough guess. So because as a father, I remember when they were like 3, 4, 5 years old, they had a lot of colds, and then it started to trend down, and eventually it's no different. Once they're a teenager, they are no different than an adult for sure, and maybe even already earlier than that. So this is a bit of a shooting from the hip, but remember I said, it seems like it takes 6 to 7 years for a human who gets for the first time exposed to common cold viruses. Normally that's as a baby, right? You start getting exposed. It takes 6 to 7 years to fully adapt to the entire cocktail of these viruses, right? And then as an adult, you are then in a stable, steady state where, yes, you get 2 to 4 colds per year, but they're usually harmless for you, and there's just a steady state, right? But as a child, initially, you have a lot more colds. And that's just because peu à peu, step by step, you get to encounter all those different viruses, and your immune system constantly builds its capabilities in that encounter, and all the complexities of, some viruses mutating rather quickly, and there being many variants of them, and each variant may be requiring a slightly fine-tuning of the immune system, and therefore all this process, it seems to take several years, and I'm saying here 6 to 7 years. And remember, I said on that logic, since we are all, even as adults, now encountering this new virus for the first time, and we are encountering the variants that are coming out, the mutations and so on, and we're going through that same process, wouldn't it be reasonable to assume that we will take a similar amount of time, let's say 6 to 7 years, to get entirely through that learning process? Yeah, during which years we may have encountered the virus in different variants, maybe 3 or 4 times. And at some point, our immune system is so attuned to it that it just completely disappears in the soup, in the cocktail of all the other cold viruses, and it is sort of neutralized in that sense. It's not gone, but it's just it no longer matters because it makes no difference. Right? It's just another one of those 200 plus common cold viruses, right? But it takes, maybe, if my logic is correct, it takes 6 to 7 years for us to get there. Remember, I said that is something I had not originally thought about. I had always assumed, based on early data, when I looked at sort of how quickly the thing was moving, I thought, 2 to 3 years, we'll be done. That was my original logic, right? 2 to 3 years. I said 2 to 3 full common cold cycles, right? meaning the seasonal cycles, right? Which is equivalent to 2 to 3 years. So that was my original thinking. Now I'm thinking, well, maybe it actually takes longer, which means the COVID infections, or the fatalities, rather, the fatalities from COVID will have to be spread out over 6 or 7 years. So that's what I try to do. And the other thing I did here is to say, okay, then since I'm arguing this is just another pneumonia, can we compare it with the rest of the pneumonias that we are subject to, right? Just to get an order of magnitude of feeling. Is it in the same order of magnitude, or how big is this impact really? And it is striking. So what you see on this chart is from 1990 until 2017. This is actually data from the IHME, which has a model that says how many pneumonia fatalities do we have in the world per year. And what you see is it's trending down. It was 3.4 million in 1990, and it was down to 2.5 million or 2.6 million in 2017. So gradual decrease. And they broke it down into age groups. Blue is under 5-year-olds, and red is above 70-year-olds. Right? And what you can see is that pneumonia used to predominantly kill young people, very young people, little children, toddlers, babies and toddlers, basically. And that has shifted, where we are now in a situation where the biggest age group that is killed by pneumonia are the elderly. Yeah? Now, this may have clearly demographic reasons. There are ever fewer young people. as our birth rates continue to decline, there will ever be, proportionally speaking, not absolute, but proportionally speaking, certainly fewer young people and ever more old people. Right? So that alone explains this graphic to quite a significant degree. Secondly, it seems that we've made good progress on protecting babies from these types of infectious diseases through, for example, excellent hygiene at birth, and in the birth stations and so on, and also in kindergartens and in homes even. I mean, there's a big gain here is just better hygiene, especially in so-called developing countries, where hygiene conditions for children have just massively improved over these 20 years, and that explains a lot of this, right? A lot of these under 5-year-old fatalities in the past were in really poor countries, basically, not very much in the rich countries. but in very poor countries where the hygiene conditions are very poor. Mind you, most of the pneumonia fatalities are derived from bacteria and not from viruses. So the single biggest block is bacterial infections. And bacterial infections are particularly reduced through better hygiene. Yeah. So a big part of this drop in the pneumonias of the under 5-year-olds is because better hygiene means far less exposure to bacteria. The viral element is probably also going down, but less strongly. So especially influenza is one of the big triggers of pneumonia. So influenza viruses, they play a significant part. Cold viruses, as we've said before, don't play a big part. There is some part, so you can always, even before COVID, you could get a pneumonia via a cold virus. That's always been possible, and especially in children that has been to some degree prevalent, but far less interestingly than influenza virus. So there's one interesting question that comes out of this whole thing for me, that is, what's different about a cold virus compared to an influenza virus? Now, what's that difference? Why? Because both cold viruses and influenza viruses do trigger pneumonias in old people. But in young people, very young people with small children, the influenza virus does, and the cold virus, by and large, doesn't. So that's really interesting, and at least that's what I read into the data. So I mean, I would need to check that with an expert that I'm reading the data right. But that would be interesting to know. Why are common cold viruses relatively harmless to children? Yeah. Whereas influenza viruses are not. They are quite risky for small children. Yeah. And since I'm arguing SARS-CoV-2 is a cold virus, it's interesting. Okay, that's why there are so few fatalities among small children from COVID, because somehow a cold virus just doesn't seem to be such a big issue for a small baby, whereas an influenza virus is more likely to be a big issue for a baby. So why? I don't know. Something in the structure of the virus, how it docks onto a cell or what it does inside the cell. I don't know. Something is different between the two that makes the influenza virus more dangerous, especially for small children, than the cold viruses such as SARS-CoV-2. So that's interesting. But anyway, so we've been trending down, but 3 million people typically here over this period, 3 million in a year die of pneumonia. Nobody cares because it's considered normal, right? And it is normal. It's totally normal that you die of infectious diseases such as pneumonia. It's totally normal. That's the most normal way for human beings to die. Until about 100 years ago, that's how most people died, right? Only this century, we've decided that everybody is now forced almost by law to die of cancer or of heart disease or other ugly things, which are much more slow, often much more slow death than a pneumonia, which kills you fairly quickly. Right? Römer said, some doctor in the early 20th century said this is the old man's friend because it kills them quickly. Once your immune system is no longer really good shape, boom, it takes care of you. Today, what this wise man said 100 years ago, today we've turned that upside down and said, pneumonia is the last thing you're allowed to die of. Oh my gosh, infectious disease. Oh, no. You are only permitted to die of cancer and of heart disease. That's the only legal way to die. So we are now living in a world where we are no longer even allowed to die in the way we want. Government tells us which deaths are acceptable and which deaths are not acceptable. Yeah, and pneumonia, for some reason that I cannot explain, is bad. Yeah. So, but anyways, people have been dying of pneumonia forever, and if you sort of extrapolate to the left, you can imagine that, not so long ago, 5, 6, 7 million people a year will have died of pneumonia, which brings us to the situation we've been in the last 18 months. If you look at the middle part of the chart here, of the graphic, the yellow is, I'm just putting the COVID fatalities on top of the other pneumonia. And you can see it's a big boost, so it is understandable that people don't just ignore it, right? It's too big to just ignore it. I think we can all agree on that, right? It more than doubles, almost triples the number of pneumonia fatalities in those 2 years, and then it goes down, right? So it's not something we can just ignore. But if you were to go back another 20 years, maybe to 1970 or 1960, you might find that as many people died of pneumonia as did this year and last year. And you know what? The population in 1960 was less than half of what it is today. So proportionally to the population, twice as many people would have died of pneumonia in 1960 than this year, including COVID. So that puts it back into perspective, I think, because yes, if you look at the last few years and the trend that has been down, people don't longer very much expect to die of pneumonia. It's becoming rarer and rarer, and that's great. But if you only go back by, let's say, 50 years, the numbers we have right now would have been completely normal. Completely normal. Again, I'm not advocating that we should have done nothing and just simply ignored it. I'm just advocating we should have been considerate in how we act, and we could have, as I said many times, we could have had far fewer deaths from COVID if we had done the right thing. So I'm not advocating do nothing, I'm advocating do the right thing. But we decided to do the wrong things. And partially driven by some irrational fear of this pneumonia that 50 years ago, people would have considered totally normal, these numbers. It would have been totally proportionally, even actually, as I say, probably now is, even with COVID on top, it's proportionally less pneumonia fatalities than 50 or 60 years ago. It's my guess. I haven't got those numbers, so it's just a guess. Yeah. If I had the numbers, I would show them to you, but unfortunately, this model doesn't go further back. And I try to Google what are pneumonia deaths in 1969, but there's no good data. There's maybe for the US, there's data, or for some European country, but not global. So I didn't want to do too much guesswork, and it's just out of interest. But if you can imagine how the curve just slopes up. There will be a maximum somewhere because the populations were so much smaller in the past that somewhere it will then go down again, right? Just in absolute numbers, right? It cannot go up forever, but for a few years or decades, it will probably continue to slope up to the left if you were to extrapolate to the left. And you can imagine that in 1960s, it would have been 6-7 million people who died, and that would have been proportionally out of, let's say 3 billion people who lived at the time, would have been more than double, proportionate to the population, more than double than what we have this year, including COVID. Yeah. So it puts it into perspective, right? This COVID thing, yes, was a big jump compared to the last 2 or 3 decades, but compared to the longer run history of mankind, this is absolutely nothing unusual at all. It's just in our minds, we are no longer used to being susceptible to an infectious disease. We somehow are so embarrassed by it. How come us superhumans, we fall prey to a virus? No, we can't have that, right? We can't have that. So there is something like, I don't know, pride or just such a detachment from nature that the idea that we might succumb to a virus it's no longer palatable to us or something. And I can understand all of that. Yeah, I can understand we are humans and we try to protect ourselves, and we have technology and we say, oh, we can protect ourselves against infectious diseases quite effectively. For example, with hygiene. That's more the bacterial ones than the viral ones. But yeah, we have means to protect ourselves. So why shouldn't we? And I agree. Why shouldn't we? We should. I'm not against that. But we went completely overboard with our measures against something that is actually quite within the normal, realm of things that, yeah. And we became so irrational about it, right? It's this irrationality that I'm arguing against, not against taking measures, but we could have taken legal measures that are effective. Instead, we took illegal measures that are ineffective. I mean, what's the point? right? So this number in the yellow boxes could have been a lot lower, by 2 or 3 million lower, is my guess. I will get back to that at some point, maybe early next year. I wanna actually try to model that. But you know, it could have been much lower if we, for example, just had used the vaccines the way I was advocating in December last year. I was saying, just give it to those people, just really focus it on those people who are at risk and identify those people one-on-one, one by one, talk to them, offer it to them. Yeah, some people will not want it. That's fine. That's their choice. They're adult people. If they don't want to be vaccinated, that's fine. But you offer it to them. You make it as convenient to them, and you put a message around it, which is you are really at risk. For you, it's a really good idea to take this, right? And you show them the statistics, right? I mean, we have all these statistics. Instead, the governments did the opposite. They completely watered down the message. Oh, everybody has to have it. You have a target, 70% of the population. This is not about the whole population. This is about a subsegment of the population. That's the difference, right? If we had targeted the vaccines, we would have saved a lot of lives. But by and large, we didn't target them. We spread them out. And then people, at some point, you reach 70% and they get tired of vaccination, and some people don't want it anymore. And then you get people, especially among the elderly, you get people who say, oh, if everybody around me gets the vaccine, then why I don't even need it, right? Why should I? I mean, you know, everybody around me has the vaccine, so that, you know, I feel very safe now. So you get the wrong people taking the vaccine, and you know, the ones you actually wanted to target don't take the vaccine. So you get it exactly the wrong way around. Now, that may not be so common. That may be an exception rather than the rule. But you know, I can totally picture. I can picture that there are countries in which the penetration with vaccine is higher among the middle-aged than among the elderly, even though the middle-aged don't need it. By and large, they don't need it, with some exceptions, diabetes, obesity. And in some countries, those are big groups. Don't get me wrong, I understand that. In some countries, diabetes is 10% of the population, or obesity and diabetes together is more than 10% of the population. I understand that these are not trivial numbers, right? But there's still a subsegment that can be targeted, right? And that is what we got wrong. We just spread it out to people who, by and large, don't need it, right? And those people who actually still who need it, there are still people now in the world who need it, or let's say who would benefit if they took it, and they're not getting it. So complete misallocation of resources, right? And that has killed probably 2 or 3 million people is my rough guess at this moment. And I'll come back to that. So anyways, so this year will be the peak. If my numbers are correct, I'm projecting out to 1st of January. Remember on the other chart where I showed you my little projection to 1st of January, and I said it's about 11 million. The reason I did that projection is because I needed it for this number here. So I built it into this year. And so I'm calculating roughly that this year we will, you know, it's the peak year, partially because last year was not a full year. In most parts of the world, except China, the fatalities only really started coming in March or even April. So you had two and a half, almost 3 months of the year where there were few fatalities, not counting China. China, again, we don't know, and it's not in the model, right? But in the rest of the world, for the first 3 months last year, there were not that many fatalities, and then it really started, right? So that is one reason why last year had fewer fatalities than this year. I mean, you would have expected, since we had the vaccine since January this year, you would have expected that this year would have significantly fewer fatalities than last year. But it turns out we will have more fatalities, the COVID fatalities, than last year. We'll have about 6 million by the end of this year, and last year we had about 5. Which is disappointing because we've had the vaccine since January, right? And I'm arguing that out of the 6 million, 2 or 3 million we probably could have avoided if we had just used the vaccine rationally. And I'm still arguing that if you then put on top the fatalities from the side effects of the government measures, the sort of excess mortality beyond the COVID numbers, if you pile that all on top, you know, the missed opportunity with the vaccine that we didn't use properly, plus the ones we killed with our measures beyond the COVID fatalities, other people killed because of government policy. If you add those together, I'm still convinced we will eventually get to a point where more people have been killed by governments in these 2 years, let's say, if we look to like next summer to sort of sum it up a little bit, more people will have been killed by government policy than in the so-called Holocaust that the Nazis did. The Nazis killed about 6 million people in the Holocaust, mostly Jews and also Gypsies and some other groups. Right? About 6 million is the number I have in my top of my head. You can double check it, but I think it's about 6 million. I'm arguing that our governments collectively, globally, when the dust settles, will have killed more than 6 million people. More than were killed in the Holocaust. Completely unnecessarily. Of course, the Holocaust was also completely unnecessary. It was complete madness to kill these people, right? And the same is true here. It's complete madness. We're killing people for absolutely no reason other than our stupidity. Yeah. Okay, and then the good news is then it really ought to be trending down. Now, this is, of course, if all my assumptions are correct, right? Caveat, but I think they are, so I'm optimistic. So then in 2022, we will have far fewer deaths, and then we'll get to the point where people no longer notice, right? Because the additional COVID fatalities relative to other pneumonia fatalities will be so small. And you could also compare them with influenza fatalities, etc. And you would just, at some point, people will just no longer notice, right? So the thing will wither slowly away. But my argument was, it doesn't go away next year. It takes 6 or 7 years to slowly sort of trend fully away, right? So I spread the remaining within my model. Remember, the ceiling is 12.85, and then I'm saying no, but some will be saved by the vaccine. So I lowered the ceiling down to, I think, 12 or something. And so, there's not that many fatalities to come. And so I spread them a little bit over 5-6 years. That I'm doing that correctly is anybody's guess, right? This is just a visual for now. But think of it as this year is the peak. And then from next year, the numbers will be starting to really drop off because we are just reaching that ceiling where everybody is headed or has been vaccinated. So the virus just doesn't really get into our lung anymore, basically, right? And if it doesn't get into our lung, it's harmless, right? So yeah, so that's what I'm looking to. So we will be back to like normal, typical annual pneumonia figures already more or less by second half of next year, if you like. We'll probably be at a point where people, they may still worry about it in their mind, but they wouldn't be able to point to any kind of figures of any relevance because there wouldn't be any. So, I mean, there would be some fatalities forever, yes, but they were so small compared to other fatalities that people won't, they won't care at some point. Right? At some point, they will start forgetting about the whole thing. Which is good. This is one of our strengths as human beings. We are forgetful. Thank God, right? Imagine we would be worrying about this for the rest of our lives now. We don't have to. We don't have to at all. The only thing that we're not good at it, if we implement some policies, whether they're good or bad policies, we never stop the policies then later. Yeah. So I'm afraid that all the policies that governments put into place now, we'll still have them in 20 years, even though the virus is long irrelevant. Right? But the policies, just once you put them in place, they stick. Yeah, for no reason. And at some point, you have all these rules and regulations in your books that nobody remembers why. But they're just there. And it's so much easier for the politicians to add policies and rules and laws than to take them out, apparently. They hardly ever take a law out. It takes them sometimes 100 years. There's some ancient law there that nobody agrees is relevant now and is completely contradictory to what we are trying to do, but it's in the books. And it takes them 100 years, literally, to get rid of it. But to create new laws or rules, that's like, which means the body of rules and laws just keeps growing and growing and growing. It's an inflation, right? I wonder whether it's like a balloon that at some point just explodes. I don't know. One more point about this, and I'm done. There is something iffy about my my method because I'm just adding the COVID fatalities to the other pneumonia fatalities. So I'm adding the yellow is the COVID ones, and then the other colors are the other, right? I'm just putting them on top of each other as if they're independent of each other. They're not actually in truth, independent of each other. For example, government policy may have the effect that it slows the progression in sanitation and medical capacities, etc. So the trend that you saw in the pneumonia, the trending down, where I said a lot of it is due to hygiene, especially in developing countries, some of that trend may have been temporarily slowed down or even halted because of the COVID policies, which means this forecast, this just smooth trending the pneumonia figure down, may be wrong, because thanks to the COVID policies, that number may actually this year, next year, and following years may go up, which is one of the reasons why we have this excess mortality. So additional pneumonia fatalities, non-COVID pneumonia fatalities that we would not otherwise have had, they will come in because of these policies, these lockdowns and all these disruptions, supply chain disruptions, all the, hospitals being overcrowded and, no investment in hospitals and so on. All these government policies or lack of policies will drive that underlying trend line for pneumonia up. Yeah, so we already know that this forecast that I made here, I'm just trending it down with this sort of more or less straight line, a slightly curved line, just for visual, just because I don't know any better, right? But actually, we know in 2020 and 2021, probably the pneumonia, non-COVID pneumonia figures will go up as a secondary effect of the COVID policies, right? So that is part of the surplus or excess mortality that I keep talking about. Some part of that is pneumonia fatalities, right? But I'm not showing that here because I don't know, I have nothing to hold on to. How big is that? Right? So I'm not. Then there's a second effect which goes the opposite way, that COVID fatalities to some degree crowd out other pneumonia fatalities. So think about it. The typical COVID fatality is someone who is about 78 years old and has a compromised immune system, right? That's the typical profile of these COVID fatalities. Now, that's exactly the same person who might have gotten pneumonia anyways, even in the same year, or maybe a year later, right? So COVID death just supersedes statistically for some of these 5 million people yellow in last year and 6 million people yellow this year. For some proportion of those, they would have died of a pneumonia anyways, within this year or next. So if I stack them just on top of each other, as I'm doing here, I'm actually double counting a few people. Because the same people up there in the yellow, they would have been down there anyways. You see, because they are, by definition, the ones who are more susceptible to getting a pneumonia, right? So some of them would have, statistically, right? Yes, so I'm double counting them, right? So, so COVID is sort of crowding some of those pneumonia fatalities out. In other words, I would actually have to downward adjust that the thing at the bottom a little bit. Yeah. So my first point that I made about the government policy, I would have to up it a little bit. The second point I'm making, I actually would have to down it a little bit. And then there's a third thing, which is about accounting. Some COVID fatalities will be accounted for as non-COVID pneumonia because people in some countries, they die of pneumonia. And if you don't do a PCR test, you can't know that it's a COVID pneumonia. You just call it pneumonia. So there will be death certificates, pneumonia, without actually that person would have tested positive on SARS-CoV-2, and therefore it's relatively likely that their pneumonia is actually a COVID pneumonia. But if they didn't test the person, then they can't know that. And then the death certificate will say pneumonia. So they then go into that bottom number and not into the COVID number, you see. So, so that would be a replacement effect of the bottom number getting bigger and conversely the top number getting a bit smaller in the same proportion, right? Because it's just a misallocation. Some COVID fatalities will not have been recognized as such. And I know there's also the opposite effect. Some COVID fatalities are declared COVID fatalities, but they aren't. Remember very early, I talked about that Hamburg professor who did like 40 autopsies, and he said 20% of them didn't die of COVID, even though their death certificate says COVID, but they didn't die of COVID, they died of something else. so there's an overcounting, but there's, as I've been saying, probably more under-accounting than over-accounting. So in other words, there are probably more people who are sort of declared a standard pneumonia who could have been registered as a COVID person because they did have the virus, right? And therefore, it is somewhat likely that the pneumonia was derived from that virus, from the SARS-CoV-2. It's not 100%, right? Mind you, they may have had some other viruses or some bacteria that actually triggered the pneumonia. We cannot really know, right? But I think the convention is if that person was tested positive within like 2 weeks before they get sick or something, we assume it's a COVID pneumonia. And that is, I think, a fair enough assumption because it is quite likely to be the case, but it's not 100%. Right? The person may have had all sorts of other viruses and things right, at the same time, right? And we cannot be sure that it was the SARS-CoV-2 that triggered the pneumonia, right? Even if we find it in the lung, even if it's isolated out of the lung, you know, the question is, are there other viruses, right? So it's complex, right? I guess what I'm saying is stacking the normal pneumonia or the other pneumonias and then the COVID pneumonia on top of it may not be exactly right. There's some overlap here, there's some misallocation, and I don't know exactly how that plays, right? So I've decided to just stack them on top of each other and go with it, but at least put those 3 points down here just to share with you that there are some iffy things going on with these numbers, you know, take them with a grain of salt, and there are some effects and side effects that we cannot really quantify. We know they are there, but we can't quantify them. So I have not made the effort to try even to quantify them. On what basis, right? It will be very iffy. And I've just said, okay, I'll just stack COVID pneumonia on top of the other pneumonia. And I just assume, for the sake of simplicity, I assume they're additive to each other. But I know they're not exactly additive to each other, okay? But here it gives you a picture of, you know, what's the impact graphically of these sort of 2 years of heavy duty COVID fatalities, right? It gives you a visual. It puts it into perspective. Okay, mapping progressions, there's not that much to, remember I do this every month, there's not so much to say. Sweden has been some increase in fatalities, not much. I think they've expired some of their, most of their measures, the COVID measures, you know. Not clear yet that the winter has started, but I think within the next few weeks, we will probably see a winter effect. Germany, yeah, similar. They had a bit of an overhang, a yo-yo effect, because they, two things, they at some point in the spring, they had to release some of those measures because people were getting really, really angry at the measures. And at the same time, they were a bit slow at the beginning, rolling out vaccines. So you had a double whammy, and that's why you had a bit of a bump in fatalities in like April, May. But then you had a quiet summer, and you now have a slight increase as you would expect. So Germany pretty much exactly on the curve at the moment that we would anticipate. US always a bit above the curve. Interesting that in the last month or two, very significant fatalities. Why? I think there's a combination of the Delta virus really, so the US being quite liberal in terms of measures, but it differs from state to state, so not everywhere equally, I have to say that. So there's a variety, but in some parts it's quite liberal. And that allowed the Delta virus, which is, as you know, the most transmissible of them all, and it's now dominating everywhere, pretty much dominating, as you would expect. And I think that really proliferated in the US in those last 2 months, and that drove a lot of infections. And at the same time, there was a vaccination fatigue in the US, also in some other European countries. You reach certain percentage, 60%, 70% in that range, and it gets harder and harder to get people to vaccinate, right? Which is understandable, and it goes back to what I just said. If the governments had not insisted on vaccinating everybody, but if they had insisted on being very clear who is the target and had communicated with those target segments very clearly, you would have gotten a much better yield where it matters. But by having this watered down message, everybody should, vaccine, there will be some people who just either don't want to bother, or they say, oh, if everybody else does it, then why should I? I don't need to, right? I'm protected. That kind of thinking. And of course, they are not protected because the vaccine doesn't actually prevent the virus from spreading, right? But they don't know that because the governments didn't tell them the truth, right? Yeah, a lot of people don't understand how it works because the government isn't telling them the truth about how it works, and partially because the government itself doesn't understand it. I mean, it's shocking after 18 months, but they still don't understand it. So yeah, so you get fatalities in the US, but nothing too dramatic. And I think there is currently even a slight slowdown, but then the winter will also hit the US, right? Probably in the Northeast and then Northwest and, you know, and the middle, and it will come down, you know. So over the next months, you know, fatalities will continue going down maybe for a little while because the effect of the Delta virus of that spread has withered out, fizzled out a little bit. And then before the next fatalities from the autumn and winter seasonality kick in, takes a few weeks, right? So maybe by the end of next month, when we see each other again, we will just see that the curve is going up again. We'll see. I'm not here to do crystal ball gazing, but you know, I'm just trying to highlight that we do know quite a lot, but then there are also always things that we cannot really anticipate, such as a new variant that is quicker, like Delta. You know it's going to happen, but you don't know when. Right? So you cannot have that in your model. Right? It's just not possible because you can't. You know a quicker variant will come, but you have no way of knowing how quickly. Right? So we can't model that. We can model seasonality, but we cannot model things like mutations and variants. Maybe we can, over a long run, if we've looked at this for 30 years, maybe there's a pattern. Yeah, but in a 2-year perspective or 18 months perspective, we cannot know. We cannot know how quickly the new mutations pop up. I mean, the ones that matter, that are successful. At the moment, we don't know that. Yeah. Okay, UK, yeah, they had a big hammer in winter, then they loosened up quite a bit, then they had the Freedom Day event in July, and since then you have a bit of a yo-yo effect. So the British allow themselves more fatalities than most of the other Europeans at the moment. That's why the curve here in September is above the green line, but it's not tremendous. You know, I think the Brits are probably to this point saying we accept that in exchange for having more freedoms. Yeah, some of it is a yo-yo effect because they hammered so much, as I said before. Then you change the entire pattern of the seasonality, and the virus will then bounce back, right? So some of this may be yo-yo effect, and some of it is just simply because they've opened up, and you would expect, you know, more infections and therefore also more fatalities, even if you have 70% vaccination penetration, right? So this is sort of as you would expect, nothing dramatic. Everything now in the UK, I think, going according to plan. We'll have to see again how it pans out in winter. I think that's still a bit of a question mark, right? I mean, we all know the vaccines work, so we know there will be fewer fatalities. But you know, maybe not some other variant comes along, and so I think we're all curious to see how the winter pans out, right? And the governments are holding their breath. I think nobody quite knows. I think we're all optimistic that we won't have that many fatalities in Europe and in North America and in Northern Hemisphere countries because of the vaccines, right? And also because we're getting to a general saturation level. But how exactly it will pan out in the next 3 months or 6 months is, we honestly don't really know. So we'll see. Yeah, divergence. General trend, penetration, you know, growing slowly in most parts with the virus. So very undramatic months, as I said. Vaccination rates, some countries made good progress in the last months in vaccinating people, but there are also quite a number of countries now where it's really slowing down because it's sort of, yeah, you hit like the 60 or 70%, and then apparently there's just a sort of a remainder of people who just simply don't want the vaccine or don't bother, right? And that seems to be somewhere around 60 or 70%, or maybe 70 to 75%, maybe in that range. So there, then you get a real slowing down of the vaccination rates. Thanks to the vaccinations now, those very slow countries, the new normal countries, and some of the middle two countries, they're now not so far away from getting fully saturated, right? And it's mostly a function just how quickly they roll out their vaccinations, right? And remember, I make assumptions that many of these vaccinations are wasted, and I don't count them. I mean, there's a mechanism behind it, which I think I shared once, so and I don't want to repeat myself, but so I'm taking into account that most of these vaccines are wasted anyways, but there is a certain proportion, which I have to estimate, which is not wasted, because it does go to those people who actually benefit from it, right? And so I'm taking that into account, and with that, most countries now are only 6, 7, 8 months away. I mean, most of those new normal countries. So remember, they used to be like 20 or 30 or 40 months away. Now they're only 6, 7, 8 months away. Interestingly, Germany is one of the worst performers in this respect. I mean, and that's a combination of very slow progression of the infection, because Germany is so micromanaging everything. So the progression of the infection is slow, and the vaccination program has slowed as well. Right? And those two things can be linked. I mean, this is another thing that governments, I think, have not considered enough when they started all these things. If you give people a sense of security by micromanaging, mini lockdowns and local rules and what's allowed, what's not allowed, yes, by micromanaging at the local level, you can reduce the activity of the virus. That is certainly true, and that has been true for 18 months. We knew that that's the case. But we've also always known that artificially slowing down the virus is not necessarily a good thing. It has repercussions. One of the repercussions is, and we see that in countries like New Zealand, for example, people just don't bother to get vaccinated because they feel so safe. Oh, we're managing the virus so well. Why should I vaccinate? Right? That's a downside of of being a micromanager. Right? I think people didn't. I mean, I said this 18 months ago already. That it's so obvious to me, but I think most people don't realize that you make a choice of micromanaging every aspect of a person's life. At some point, they go completely dull and say, okay, government takes care of everything, and why should I vaccinate? Why take any kind of initiative on my own, given that the government for the last 18 months has told me not to do anything? Like they've completely taken the responsibility away from me, and now they come and say, oh, but you should get vaccinated. Oh, now, after 18 months of not having any responsibility for my health, now all of a sudden you're giving the onus on me, putting the onus on me to go and get vaccinated? No. I mean, they've completely dulled down, right? They're assuming no, government does everything, and by themselves to do anything, no. And they don't feel threatened, right? Because the virus is slow, not many fatalities. Oh, why should I vaccinate? It's okay. But they don't realize that it's just a never-ending story if they don't get out of it. Either they have to get naturally infected or they have to be vaccinated. Otherwise, it just keeps going. People don't seem to be realizing that. And now it's actually Germany, of all places, that is at risk of not getting out of this mess, right? Together with some of the new normal countries. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, nothing new here. Let me not dwell on things that at some point I will have to revise these things, but not yet. Policy mania. Yeah, let's just briefly talk about this. So we have now 9.3 million CACs. CACs is cattle units, right? Normally for people, we call PAX, P-A-X, as an abbreviation. So since we're all being treated like cattle, I've changed that to CACs. So number of CACs, that's people like us, right? CACs. Killed by the compromised immune systems, we are now at 9.3 million. Expected to be killed 12.85. That's my ceiling based on my IFR. Total excess mortality, as I said, above that ceiling now. So the difference between, first of all, the difference between 12.85, which is the calculated number, and the 9.3 is at this moment 3.5 million fewer fatalities, COVID fatalities than expected. Okay, so at the moment, those are the ones saved by government policy, either lockdown, slow down the virus, vaccines, all of that together, right? Now that number will continue to shrink because, of course, every month there are additional COVID fatalities, right? So that number goes down, but it is at the moment 3.5 million. But then if we look to the total excess mortality and compare that with the people killed by the immune system, meaning in conjunction with COVID, then there is a gap of 4 million, right? So 4.17 million people more have died, according to the excess mortality figures, which I always keep saying they are iffy, so I acknowledge that, but that's the best I have. And in January, hopefully governments will have published new excess mortality figures. At least most governments don't even bother to publish them, so I can only rely on those that I have. But hopefully there will be some fresh excess mortality figures, and hopefully they will be more reliable than last year. So, maybe that number will still have to change. It could go up or down, I don't know, but hopefully it will get more robust. But at the moment, based on the numbers available to me, about 4 million people in excess of the 9 million COVID fatalities have died in conjunction with, COVID in terms of the policy, the government policies, so indirect factors. And the point here is that 4 million who have been killed by government policy is already bigger than the 3.5 million who have been saved by government policy, right? To the tune of 660,000 people. So government already at this stage has killed a net 660,000 people. And that number will just keep going up every month, right? Yeah. So, as I said earlier, at some point we will be at a level of the Holocaust, 6 million. That would then have to include a theoretical number of people who could have been saved if the vaccines had been used properly. That I will have to calculate. That's not in here. Yeah, we'll see. Now, the other thing that is worth highlighting, I said it before, those who have been saved are on average 78 or 79 years old and have an average life expectancy, in my best guess, of maybe 5 years or even less, because they are 78 on average, and we know they have compromised immune systems, otherwise they wouldn't be getting this, right? So they are the ones who are already susceptible to any kind of infectious diseases, any kind of pneumonia. That's why I said earlier on the chart, I said I stacked them on top of each other. Actually, one is crowding out the other to some degree, or replacing, right? Because some of these, or double counting, I call it, because some of these people who die of COVID, they would have died of pneumonia anyways, this year or next. Some proportion of them, and it's an unknown proportion, but it is a positive number, right? For sure, it's conceptually very clear, right? So because they are exactly the people who are, by definition, the most susceptible to any kind of pneumonia, right? So how big that number is, we don't know, but so I made some assumptions. So there was a study that said, okay, in Europe, they looked at Italy, the average age then was, I think, 79, and they said, but a 79-year-old in Italy has, when they're 79, statistically has an 8 or 9 year life expectancy. So they were pointing out that these people, because someone had said, oh, these are old people, they're anyways dying soon, and then that person did the calculations, and no, not so soon. They have 8 or 9 years life expectancy left on average. And then I came, remember, and I said, yeah, that's very good, but these are not average 78 years old. These are the ones who are dying, right? Means their immune system is weaker than that of all the others, right? Therefore, their life expectancy is not 8 or 9 years. It's less than that, right? And so I've just plugged in 5 years here. I don't really know. It could be even less than that, right? But, or it could be a bit more, but it's not 8 or 9 years. It's less, probably significantly less, right? Because these are the most vulnerable people. They are by definition the ones who end up dying, right? So we are saving people whose life expectancy is 5 years on average. We are killing people, young people, old people, middle-aged people across the board, maybe pretty much according to average demographics, with not quite, because there will be a proportion of these people who are elderly and they need medical treatment, and because they can't get the right medical treatment in time or in the right quality because of COVID effects. So some people die who are old age. they don't die of COVID, but they die because COVID crowds out the capacity in the hospital system, etc. Right? So there will be a slight bias among these people who are killed by government policy towards the elderly and towards the more vulnerable, but it's not that strong a bias. So the average or median age of the global population at the moment is about 30. And their statistical life expectancy as of today is something like almost 50 years. So if you are 30 today, globally, you have another almost 50 years to go, maybe 45 or so. Of course, if you're male, less than female, but yeah, on average, right? I'm averaging it. Okay, and in some countries, much more than in others. In Japan, you have 60 years ahead of you. And in other countries, only 35, right? Yeah, but rough numbers, it's probably more than 40 years life expectancy that the average person who is 30. But since I'm saying, oh, there may be slight bias towards the elderly being a bit more vulnerable because of certain reasons that I can imagine, although that may not be fully true, right? It could be that the very young ones are also more vulnerable, right? And that would balance the age allocation. So I don't really know, but I've just put in 40 years. I said, okay, the average person killed by unintended side effects and consequences of the government policies, people who commit suicide, people who die because they don't get the right treatment, people who don't get enough food and, they whatever, right? They are on average 40 years life expectancy, right? So 8 times as much life expectancy as the ones who are saved. Yeah? So we are not only at a place already where more people are being killed than saved, but if you count not the number of lives, but you count the number of life years, you have to increase that number by a factor of 8. Yeah, and so if you have, let's say, 1.2 times as many die than necessary, and then you pile a factor of 8 on that, then you have a multiplier of 10. So you have an order of magnitude. 1 order of magnitude means a factor of 10. You have 1 order of magnitude more lifetime destroyed than lifetime saved. And that's where we're heading, or we are already there. Government has destroyed, all governments in the world together have destroyed 10 times as much lifetime as they have saved. And that saving came mostly with the help of the vaccines. And as I said, it could have been so much more if they had done the right thing about the vaccines. So, but we are taking what they actually did. Yes, they're saving some lives, but not that many. And at the same time, they're destroying more lives. And those lives are on average much younger lives, and therefore much longer life expectancy that you're destroying. Yeah. So if you want to do accounting, and I'm not really a big fan of all these accounting things, because for me, the most important thing, as you know, is like liberty and, principles, like our rights, our constitutions that have been destroyed. That's, to me, much more important than, counting dead bodies, right? But for those people who always make the argument, oh, we have to save lives, we have to save lives, I'm just doing these calculations for those people to tell them, but you aren't saving lives. Net, you're destroying lives with your policies, right? That's why I'm doing this. Just because there are people who go, oh, but we have to save lives, we have to save lives. Yeah, we could have, but we didn't. Yes, we could have saved lives, but we didn't. And we are not even today, and we are continuing to do the wrong things, and we're continuing to kill more people than we save. That's terrible, terrible, terrible. 18 months into this, it's atrocious. All right. Vaccination mania, I don't want to go into it again because I did last time. We have already applied 2.7 times as many shots as we needed to, most of them to the wrong people. Right? And so we keep upping the vaccination rate, and that's wonderful. It just doesn't do anything really. It does something because, of course, some proportion of those people who get the vaccine actually do benefit from it. But if we had been more targeted, we could have had a much bigger bang for our buck with a much smaller number of vaccines. And we could have been done by July this year, sorry. Yeah, but I've said this many times before, so I don't want to linger on it. And then on the right, what I'm saying is, if governments don't wake up, they will force us to get vaccinated like every 6 or 9 months, because they will, if they, for example, say, oh, once the antibody count in the blood goes down, then you have to get a booster. They're already starting to do boosters, right? And they're doing like 3-year-olds and 6-year-olds being, so I mean, we'll get hundreds, if not thousands of percentages of vaccination rates. Yeah, if each of us must get vaccinated and 10 times in our life, then that's 1,000%, right? But, yeah. And then government, if they do that with SARS-CoV-2, why not with the other 200 cold viruses? Why not enrich the pharmaceuticals industry by telling them, oh, we now want to have vaccines for the other 200 cold viruses too. Then you can multiply this by 200, right? And then influenza, of course, is actually more risky. So let's do influenza. Let's do mandatory influenza vaccinations. Yeah, you can pile all kinds of things on top of this. And before you know it, we are no longer human because we are so pumped up with foreign bodies that stimulate our immune system. I think our immune systems will get very dizzy. And they will say, oh, I wish I was back to normal nature. I so much prefer to have the ordinary bacteria and viruses that are out there than to be bombarded by health sectors with all these vaccinations. Right? Yeah, our pure immune system. Nobody is thinking of our immune system. Nobody is talking about our immune systems at all. I seem to be the only person on this planet talking about immune systems, even though, as I say, that is the only thing that actually matters in this whole thing is our immune systems. This is all about our immune system, nothing else. The virus is irrelevant. It could be any virus. It doesn't matter. It's our immune systems that are at stake. Nobody in any government that I know of is talking about that. So it's tremendous. It's tremendous. As if we are talking about something completely different. All right, I'm going to get to an end. Yeah, long-term scenarios. Oh, where's my here, 1st of October. Yeah, so we are moving into, I used to call this the age of robots. I've changed my mind. I call it the age of zombies because we are, after all, organic. A robot isn't typically really organic, although who knows. So we are zombies, meaning, we don't, our brains have been fried, sizzle. Our hearts are petrified. We no longer have a real heart, like courage. I mean, heart in the sense of courage, right? And our immune systems are being atrophied. And we think ourselves to be immortal. We must not die. Die is bad. That's the definition of a zombie, maybe more than of a robot. So that's why I've exchanged the robot for a zombie. I hope you like my picture. So where we could be moving to the northeast, where we revive as humans, where we can again trust our brains, where we trust our hearts and our courage, and we trust our immune systems, and we know that we are mortal and we live with that happily. We could be moving in that scenario, but at the moment we are moving in the opposite direction, right? Slowly but surely. So if we continue like this for a while, we'll all be zombies. Okay, now, where are we? Okay, I had this fanciful model. I think I postponed it last time because I ran out of time, and I think I'm going to postpone it again. This is not time sensitive. We'll get to it, but I think I've done enough today. So let me skip it. So don't worry. I'll explain this to you and just skip through and explain it to you next time. It's just a conceptual piece of throwing out ideas. So let me finish with Herder. Herder was a contemporary of Goethe, so it sort of fits to the opening with Goethe I go to. Herder was a cultural thinker, anthropologist, to some degree a philosopher, also a literary critic and one of the founders of literary criticism, and also one of the founders of historicism. So quite a busy man, almost like a universal kind of spirit. And in one of his books, it's called The Ideen, The Ideas, to a Philosophy of the History of Mankind, is the full title. He wrote this paragraph about China. This is in 1790, so 230 years ago. Just read it. So the reason I brought this is he was writing about China. This is an outsider's perspective on China. He had never traveled to China himself, so he was purely basing this on reports from China. He was very widely read, and he did have some high quality reports from European travelers who came back from China and who shared their perspectives. But this is secondhand, and it may be, if you like, one-sided, right? I don't want to argue with that. But this was the way Herder, and he was very influential. This book, The Ideen, was widely sold and widely read in that time, and highly influential. And so this does represent to some degree the perspective that Europeans had on China. And I would first of all say I agree with this, because the perspective I have on China today is exactly the same. China has literally not changed. I mean, they've gone from feudalism to communism to capitalism, yes. And yes, it is material change in that sense, in the economic sphere and wealth and so on. Yes, and that matters. I don't want to deny that. But in terms of their fundamental Confucian outlook on the role of the individual within society, arguably they have not changed at all. So the communist / capitalist system that they've imposed on top of this has not changed the underlying values at all. That's my. And I have spent a little bit of time in China. I have a slight advantage over Herder. But maybe you would argue not enough, Matthias, to really understand China. Yeah, it's a big country. Yeah, I know. But the point is not about China, actually. My point is the whole world is now like China. What Herder wrote about China 230 years ago, in my view, is now true today for the entire world. And with that, I say goodbye with a quote, Napoleon meeting Goethe, voilà un homme. And I wish I knew anybody that I can encounter like a Goethe and say, voilà un homme, and not, voilà un zombie. Bye-bye. Bye.